What makes a Telltale game good or bad? Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is NopeNapNarp, and today we're diving into the positives and negatives of Telltale Games with an in-depth look at their structure and how they attempt to mesh player expression within an existing narrative. Telltale's now famous game-making formula, or perhaps infamous formula depending on what your perspective is, has led to many successes for the developer, both critically and commercially. However, many gamers have expressed a disdain for this style of storytelling and gameplay. It is quite easy to make the argument that if you've played one Telltale game, you've played them all. In other words, while the characters change from game to game, the mechanics and choices remain almost the same. Meanwhile, others criticize the formula by saying how gameplay sections are often boring, repetitive, and too reliant on QuickTime events. All of these criticisms are legit, but yet, in my opinion, there's something special about Telltale Games, and it's something that I don't often see mentioned. While fans and critics argue over repetitive gameplay, strength of characters, and square versus circle decisions, I instead point to what I believe is Telltale's greatest strength as a developer. No, it's not easy platinum trophies. It's instead pacing. Before we get too far into this, let me just say this. I will be showing footage from a few different Telltale games, the ones that were actually pictured in the thumbnail, so this is your spoiler warning. Now, let's move on. To quickly summarize, Telltale's tendency of making a movie-like game started in 2005, with titles such as Telltale's Texas Hold'em and Sam and Max Save the World. It wouldn't be till later, in 2012, when the popularity of Telltale games would really take off with the release of The Walking Dead Season 1. From there, Telltale continued to grow by buying access to more licenses that were becoming more and more popular in mainstream culture. Telltale capitalized on the successes of TV shows like The Walking Dead and Game of Thrones, as well as movies like Guardians of the Galaxy, and finally, through the rise of other figures of popular culture, such as Minecraft and Batman. Telltale has proved their staying power in the industry, and while many claim their games are becoming stale, they continue to crank out critically acclaimed stories. And now, let's look into why so many of these games are enjoyed by so many. So like I said, I believe that the biggest strength of any Telltale game is its pacing. Something that this video may end up lacking. But before we dive too far into it though, I first want to speak a little bit about how the developers solve a big question for games of this nature. That question being, how do you allow for the player to express their own opinions, beliefs, and emotions in the game without compromising on the narrative that you hope to tell? Telltale's answer to this is rather simple, and it's to allow the player to express their thoughts through branching dialogue paths, without actually having those decisions affect the absolute major plot points of the story. In video game speak, this is known as minor narrative interactivity, and it allows for the illusion of player freedom and strengthens the player's connection with the story without allowing them to get too far off the path. The player's biggest influence is on how characters of the game interact and feel about each other, instead of where the story goes. The player's input simply steers the tone of interaction the characters in the game have with each other. This solution is simple, but effective in the best Telltale games, as it grants players an illusion of choice that plays into the strong narrative that continues to grow more interesting and grand over time. It is perhaps the best way of blending the story of a movie with the player expression of a video game. And it's safe to say that not all Telltale games absolutely nail this balancing act, as the worst Telltale games often expose player limitations while also failing to keep the overall narrative interesting, engaging, and fast-paced. Now, I haven't played every Telltale game, but I have played quite a few. In my opinion, the best one I've experienced is Batman the Telltale series, while the worst is Game of Thrones. Now, in the interest of remaining open about bias, I personally love the recent Dark Knight trilogy as well as all of the Batman Arkham games, while simultaneously having zero interest in the show Game of Thrones. Perhaps the best thing I can do is to recommend you play a Telltale game that features an IP or a license that you're already interested in. But anyway, I may be a little bit biased in that regard, so keep that in mind. But I genuinely believe that Telltale's Batman is significantly better than Game of Thrones, and I intend to explain why as this video goes on. For a nice point of comparison, I will be using Telltale's Tales from the Borderlands as a neutral point, as before playing that game, I've never had any interaction with any Borderlands game. Shocking, I know, but it should serve as a good baseline. So let's quickly summarize each of these games. Batman has you playing as billionaire Bruce Wayne and his alter ego, Superman. What's that? Clark Kent? Who? Oh. Well, shit. Like I said, his alter ego, Batman. During this game's journey, Bruce Wayne and his trusty butler Alfred attempt to clear the Wayne family name and take down the latest threat to Gotham, Penguin and Lady Arkham. In Game of Thrones, you play as the Forrester family as they attempt to avenge the death of their patriarch, protect their family and property from rival houses, and discover an ancient family secret. And finally, in Tales from the Borderlands, you play as Reese and Fiona, an unlikely duo brought together by crazy circumstances. Joined by their friends, the duo fights to overcome corporate greed and series antagonist Handsome Jack. Each game has you playing through multiple episodes, with each chapter featuring choices big and small that influence the narrative without overthrowing the main story. Now, finally, let's begin to actually talk about what this video is about. Telltale's focus on quick pacing. These games all attempt to do the same thing. Keep gameplay and story sections moving quickly, while continuously offering minor and major story decisions as well as plot twists to keep the player hooked on the story. Gameplay sections are kept genuinely pretty short, whether they are point-and-click small-scale exploration sections or just quick-time events. The quick-time events are often gracious with their timing, meaning that the game has very few fail states. It keeps the story progressing at the same pace as a good movie. Meanwhile, moments of dialogue are all put on a timer to ensure that the player can't abuse the fact that they're playing a video game to stop and think about all their options. All of this is done to ensure that the pacing of the game is at the forefront in order to keep player engagement at its peak. Not to mention, as each chapter ends, the player is awarded with a trophy, and if the player likes trophies, like myself, it becomes an easy way to reward them and keep them playing. Let's see how this formula plays out in Batman, Tales from the Borderlands, and Game of Thrones.
It's over.
Just working the night shift.
Oh, well, then you're pulling a double.
People don't say no to me.
We're going to start with Batman, as I believe this Telltale game embodies their formula better than any other. Remember, spoilers ahead. From the very outset of the game, when you stop a mercenary burglar attempt, all the way through to the end as you stop Lady Arkham and save Gotham, the game has you on the edge of your seat. It accomplishes this by always keeping the story moving and the setting fresh. Chapters are normally only about 10 to 15 minutes long, and the game has you switching often between playing as Bruce and as Batman. This constant switching helps immerse players into the story, as it succeeds in appeasing our relatively short attention spans. So let's see how it accomplishes what the Telltale formula seeks to do. First, let's start with actual gameplay, which I consider something separate from the dialogue pass. That's just something different to me. Telltale capitalizes on the strengths of the Batman name, as those point-and-click sections are enhanced due to the nature of Batman's character. Oftentimes, point-and-click sections will have you either engaging in crime scene reconstruction or in planning out an attack on mercenaries. These two ideas are integral to Batman's character and his persona, and have been been molded to meet the fast-paced gameplay that a Telltale game needs to thrive. Crime scene sections only require you to make 3 different connections between clues within them. This leaves the player feeling as if they really are as superior a detective as Batman without bogging down the pace by having way too many clues. The attack on mercenary sections are also interesting, as you quickly plan and execute a strategy to neutralize the baddies. Again, it's playing to the strengths of the license without sacrificing pace. These types of gameplay also aren't overly used, so they feel fresh again each time you encounter them. As for QTEs, they are normally used to liven up the action when the stakes are already high. For example, this interaction between Batman and mob boss Carmine Falcone.
How about this one? Can't sneak up on me. EMP armed.
All of these gameplay examples keep the pace moving forward quickly, while also allowing the players to experience the mechanics that they would expect while playing as Batman. Second, let's look at those branching dialogue paths. Whether you are playing as Bruce Wayne or Batman, you're always surrounded by interesting characters, whether it's the voice of reason Alfred, the sexy thief Catwoman, or evil geniuses like the Penguin. With many characters and overlapping conflicts of interest, it allows for the player to express their thoughts and opinions towards each character, and because the supporting cast is so interesting and the plot's so juicy, the player is sure to form these thoughts. For example, after Bruce learns that his parents were corrupt criminals who worked with the mob, the player may feel as if Alfred has betrayed them for not sharing the truth. The game allows for the player to express this opinion, or any different one if they are so inclined. You can choose to confront Alfred about it and become angry, or you can choose to remain calm and understand his perspective. Now sure, you can say that that happens in every Telltale game, but this decision is strengthened by the plot twist that players don't see coming, as well as by the strength of the characters. I mean, really, who expects that Tom and Martha Wayne are gonna be corrupt? It's a huge plot twist, and it keeps you hooked. Another thing that the player has to consider when engaging in dialogue is this: are they speaking as Bruce Wayne or as Batman? It adds another meta layer to the dialogue system, and again, because the player can't take forever to choose how to respond, they must balance all their thoughts and opinions towards other characters quickly. Decisions that the game deems as quote-unquote major, meaning those that are either square or circle options, feel like they carry more weight in this game versus other Telltale games because the characters are much more interesting, and the game far more engaging. For example, my decision to not brutalize Carmine Falcone as Batman was influenced by all the interactions that I had had with Alfred up to that point. His words of wisdom resonated with me because of the minor dialogue options I had selected earlier in the episode. This is one example of many that I felt while playing through the Batman series, as the story was so grand and the stakes so high that each decision and interaction felt like it carried more weight. That, paired up with the excellent gameplay additions and the switching between Bruce and Batman, allowed the game to flow well and keep the pace moving quickly. This maximizes player engagement, and the shorter chapters keep them wanting to play just a little bit more. This is why I believe Batman is the best Telltale game, and I can't wait to play the follow-up series when it's completely finished. So now, let's move on to the bad. Game of Thrones. Games, a TellTale series. I believe this is one of the worst TellTale games, although I can't say for sure because I haven't played them all. Let's see how Game of Thrones fails to live up to the TellTale formula and how it fails to accomplish a fast pace. Like I mentioned earlier, this game has you playing as the Forrester family, which will see you controlling 5 different characters throughout the game. I'll talk more about why this is a negative thing in a bit, but first, like Batman, let's start with gameplay. Here, the point-and-click sections are not nearly as interesting or engaging as in Batman, because the license the game is borrowing from doesn't provide an interesting or unique way to influence them. Most of the time, you walk around a small area, look at a few things in the environment, before you stumble upon the one you need to advance the story. Instead of providing interesting challenges that empower the player, they instead feel like exercises in boredom, and oftentimes you must look at multiple items before the correct item even allows you to analyze it. It slows down the pace immensely when you have to shuffle through item after item until you get the right one, and each failed attempt just gives you a boring piece of dialogue that normally doesn't enhance or contribute to the main story. It sucks. QTE events are okay, I guess, but don't quite feel as grand as they do in Batman. Perhaps you can say that's because the licenses are so different, but honestly, maybe that just means that Game of Thrones isn't a great choice for a TellTale Games adaptation. Next, we move on to the branching dialogue paths. So like I mentioned earlier, you play up to 5 different characters in this game, and each of their stories unfold across different parts of the world. The game has you jumping from place to place, constantly playing as someone different, to the point where sometimes I honestly forgot what was happening in one person's story because I hadn't seen them in so long. I'm not kidding. There was a point where I forgot that Asher Forrester even existed and was like, oh shit, yeah, this guy, when we finally came back to his story. I believe that TellTale hoped that jumping between so many characters would keep things always feeling fresh, but it comes off as feeling tedious, and I believe it lessens the impact that the dialogue branches have. For example, if I forgot that Asher and Beshka's story were even a thing, how the hell am I supposed to make choices for them, big or small, that represents the way that I had been playing them before? Here, the forced quick pace at making decisions actually hampers the game, because you're constantly having to recall what characters are involved in each different playable character's subplot. I'm sure this jumping around between characters is meant to mirror the show, but honestly, I just found it to be completely jarring, and it made my decisions feel less impactful because of it. And honestly, the game's pace really suffers from the fact that, in order for some character stories to advance to the point where they need to be at, other parts of the story have to be slowed way down. The game tries to tell the player that the White Hill threat at the Forrester homestead is so imminent. Yet, it seems like every time we go back to playing as Roderick, nothing of importance happens. It's just bickering between 2 pissed off families. Finally, when I felt like something was actually happening there and that the story was actually moving, the game punished me for trying to attack Lord Whitehill by making it a fail state. Why even give me the option to attack if it was a guaranteed fail state? Super immersion breaking, no doubt. There are many examples of slow pace I could cite, but we have to move on for the sake of time. But if you want to know some more, you just let me know in the comments and I'll tell you my thoughts. Overall, in my opinion, Game of Thrones is a mess. Gameplay sections aren't very interesting, and the jumping from character to character doesn't keep the game fresh. It just slows it down completely, which to me spells bad news for a TellTale game. So finally, we move on to the middle ground, and the first TellTale game I ever played, Tales from the Borderlands. Now, before playing this game, I never really had a true understanding of how a Telltale game played, and so it allowed me to explore the developer's mechanics and story presentation style with a license I had no experience with: Borderlands. I believe that Tales from the Borderlands isn't quite as good as Batman, but it does enough to keep the player interested in playing to the end. It's still a good game. The second half of the game in particular really pulled me in after setting up these characters during the first few episodes. Now for this one, in true spirit of a Telltale game, we'll be quicker with the pace on this one, I promise. Gameplay. When it comes to the point-and-click sections, Borderlands suffers somewhat from the same problems that Game of Thrones does. There isn't a whole lot that makes you feel these sections stand out, as normally you just explore items as either Reese or Fiona until you find the right one to progress. However, a lot of the items you interact with lead you to feeling like you're making actual progress, instead of hearing useless dialogue about nothing important. And there's other great sections as well, like controlling Loaderbot. It's unique and plays to the strengths of the series it's based off of. QTEs are pretty solid throughout and seek to enhance moments that already feel tense. Kinda like Batman, but not quite as good. Moving on, dialogue branches are pretty solid in this game, as again, unlike Game of Thrones, the characters are full of personality, and this leads to more types of interaction between them. I mean, come on, you know you love Loaderbot. Who doesn't? He's an absolute legend and a stud.
Ooh, got quiet all of a sudden.
Hi.
You split time playing between Reese and Fiona, but since they're almost always together, while simultaneously seeking different goals, the conflicts of interest feel more dynamic and susceptible to player input, even if the overall story of the game doesn't change because of it. The characters present strong personalities, and they're all different, which leads to better conflicts, which are often solved or relieved fast enough so that the pace doesn't suffer. The game overall is above average to me. It's a good game and succeeds in enough ways to play to the strengths of the Telltale formula for success. So, in conclusion, I believe that a Telltale game's biggest strength is its fast pace. The episodic nature of each series can potentially keep players hooked in enough to finish each of them in one sitting if it's done right. In order to do that, gameplay sections must utilize the rich lore and mechanics of the license it's borrowing from. Simultaneously, the game's branching dialogue paths are most effective at keeping the pace quick when they allow the player to insert their own opinions, thoughts, and feelings amongst many different, strong, and developed characters. It is in my opinion that Telltale Games, when accomplishing these two feats, make for excellent movie game experiences that have the potential to stick with you for a long time. And that brings us to the end of today's video. I want to hear in the comments what you guys think about what I've presented here. Do you like Telltale Games or do you not like them? Does your favorite Telltale game succeed in keeping the pace moving forward? Please share any and all thoughts below and I'll be sure to respond. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. And as always, have a nice day, and take care.